Welcome to week 3, part 1. This week we will focus on nursing legislation and College of Nurses of Ontario. A little bit of background on the legislative processes. So, democratic countries like Canada have a legislature or a parliament with the power to make new laws or change old ones. Canada is a federation, a union of several provinces and territories with a central government. So we have both a federal parliament in Ottawa to make laws for all of Canada and a legislature in each of the 10 provinces and 3 territories that deals with laws in its specific geographical area. Laws enacted at either level are called statutes, legislation, or acts. Public law is the type of law that sets the rules for the relationship between the individual and society. It includes 3 aspects: constitutional, criminal, and administrative law. We're going to focus on administrative statutory public laws in this course because that is what allows administrative agencies, such as the College of Nurses of Ontario, to know what they need to do to enforce and to have the powers to enforce the rules and regulations. So RNs have a scope of practice that is determined by the law in the particular province or territory that they live in. In Ontario, the College of Nurses of Ontario is empowered by the provincial government to make sure that registered nurses have met and continue to meet the requirements of the profession. As administrative laws are created by legislative or administrative systems. Legislative statutory public laws are formal laws created by any level of legislation. A legislator is a deliberate assembly that has the authority to make laws for a political entity such as a country, a province, or a city. In a democracy, the members of a legislature, so they're called the legislators, are almost always elected. For example, councillors in the City of Toronto, members of the provincial parliament in Ontario, members of parliament in the federal government in Ottawa. Legislation is passed through a fairly complex process. The level of complexity often depends on the level of the legislature. It's why something like the original federal level medical assistance in dying legislation, Bill C-14, so that's the MAID legislation, took such a long time to become a law, and the changes are also taking place. In Ontario, we currently have a party in power that has a supermajority, so the Progressive Conservatives under Premier Doug Ford, which means that they hold enough seats to push through virtually anything they bring forward. Through the legislative process, though the legislative process takes some time, a party with a supermajority can make huge changes to legislation within a relatively short time frame. So, nursing-related legislation in Canada. Each province or territory has its own legislature or parliament, and the scope of nursing practice in a province territory is determined by the legislature in that individual province or territory. Part of the laws around scope of practice also includes giving an organization the right to put those laws into practice for the nurses in the specific province or territory. So, for example, the CNO has power in Ontario to set the standards for nurses who want to be registered in Ontario, but they have no power in any other province or territory. However, the overall goal for all the regulatory bodies, such as CNO, is usually very similar regardless of province. Note that because nursing practice is dependent on laws, then the scope of nursing practice in a particular province or territory can change at the will of the government in power. A good reason for nurses to be political, so changes aren't made to the detriment of the profession. One example could be that a provincial government might decide nurses don't need a degree to enter practice. Such a move would set the profession back decades in terms of credibility, professionalism, and disciplinary knowledge. Given that the PC government in Ontario has a supermajority, then nursing in this province is in a very vulnerable position. The government has already decided that nursing degrees can be granted by colleges, not just universities. What else might they decide to change? We will be talking in our last week about one change to the RN scope of practice that has been in the works since 2017. At the moment, this government does not seem to be supportive of RN prescribing. Nursing-related legislation in Ontario. Nursing in Ontario is bound by two major laws, the Nursing Act of 1991 and the Regulated Health Professions Act of 1991, or the RHPA. Each has been updated over the years, but the name stays the same. You can always find the current version of each law on the Ontario government's website. The RHPA applies to all self-regulated health professions in Ontario. For each regulated health profession, the profession's scope of practice statement broadly describes what the profession does and what the methods it uses. Note that health professions can have overlapping scopes of practice. The RHPA also details the 14 controlled acts that involved activities considered to be potentially harmful if performed by an unqualified person. So, controlled acts in Ontario. So, depending on the profession's scope of practice, a regulated health professional may be authorized to perform one or more controlled acts, but not all of the regulated health professions are authorized to perform controlled acts. Given that scopes of practices can overlap, then some professions are authorized to perform the same or parts of the same controlled acts as other professions. RNs and RPNs may perform a procedure within one of the 5 controlled acts authorized to nursing if it is ordered by a physician, dentist, or chiropodist, midwife, or nurse practitioner, or if it is initiated by an RN or RPN in accordance with conditions identified in regulation. We will talk more about this idea of initiation when we discuss delegation in week 6 of this course. It is extremely important that you understand what controlled acts you are allowed to do when you become an RN, and you also need to be aware that sometimes a healthcare setting puts restrictions on what it allows staff to do, even if an act falls within the health professional's scope of practice. So this is Ontario's nursing scope of practice statement. The practice of nursing is the promotion of health and the assessment of, the provision of, care for, and the treatment of health conditions by supportive, preventative, therapeutic, palliative, and rehabilitative means in order to attain or maintain optimal function. So a little bit about nursing and autonomy. So the government in Ontario uses legislation to give nurses our scope of practice statement and to lay out what controlled acts we can do. The government also puts into these laws the requirements for registration, including classes of registration, entry to practice requirements, and the title protection of RN. Two other important areas that are included in this legislation are quality assurance. So we'll talk about that in week 10 about CNO's quality assurance program, and professional misconduct. Provincial governments have enough to do with running their province, so they need to allow other bodies or organizations to make sure that their legislation is carried out. In Ontario, the CNO is given that power by the government to enact the legislation and to be autonomous through self-regulation. Thus, the government explicitly recognizes that the nursing profession as a unified group is in the most appropriate position to set standards and guidelines for practice and education to make sure that these standards are met and to take suitable action if they're not. So, self-regulation, let's talk about that. In Canada, the goal of all the regulatory bodies, the College of Nursing, is to protect the public. The CNO Code of Conduct was specifically developed to articulate to the public, in quotation marks, the accountabilities all Ontario nurses have to the public. Our code of ethics and our practice standards are designed to assure the public that we are ethical and competent professionals and that we are accountable in our practice. So CNO is not about protecting nurses. It's about making sure that if someone is called a registered nurse, that they meet entry to practice standards and they show continuing competence as a registered nurse and meet the evolving standards throughout their career. So CNO is given the power by the Ontario government to set the standards for entering the profession in Ontario, ensure quality of care and competence through the Quality Assurance Program, and make decisions about disciplinary action for nurses who do not meet the standards of practice. One of the ways that CNO checks if nurses applying to enter the profession in Ontario have met the entry to practice competencies is to only accept graduates from approved nursing programs. As I note in the other presentation or lecture for this week, we used to have an accreditation process in Ontario that allowed for a program to be approved. But quite recently, the CNO started their own mandatory approval process, and we will move forward with nursing programs in Ontario. And as we move forward, nursing programs in Ontario will need to be approved by CNO before their graduates will be eligible to write the NCLEX RN and become registered in Ontario. York currently has accreditation and is undergoing the CNO approval process, so you are all safe to graduate and be eligible for CNO. You should receive the registration requirements, or you should review the registration requirements the CNO expects you to meet, so that once you are nearing graduation, you know what paperwork you have to submit, how much it will all cost you, and what exams you need to write. Links to resources are on our Moodle site for this week. The last thing to consider just now is autonomy of each individual registered nurse. When you become an RN, you will be expected to take responsibility for your actions and to be accountable for those actions. You can't just follow orders. You need to think critically and refuse to do something that is wrong. RNs are expected to demonstrate their self-determination and independence. You must also be willing to take risks when needed to stand up for your own autonomy. So up next, we are going to focus on a variety of Canadian nursing organizations.